The stars above Virex 9 were calm, distant, and cold, watching silently as the diplomatic vessel Serenith glided across the black void like a silver arrowhead. Commander Thalexa Virel stood at the front of the observation deck, arms folded behind her back, her pale violet eyes locked on the glowing planet beneath. It was supposed to be a routine mission, an alliance meeting between species, nothing more. But space had its own moods. Without warning, the vessel shook violently, lights flickering, alarms blaring across the decks. Something had hit them. No weapon, no enemy, just a raw force of nature, an ion storm, unpredictable and deadly. The shields collapsed in seconds, and the ship began to fall apart. Thalexa ran toward the escape pods, yelling orders, but before she could even finish speaking, a wall of flame and pressure knocked her off her feet and sent her world into blackness. She awoke to silence and pain. Her pod had slammed into a jagged rock formation, half buried in ash and ice. Her leg was pinned under debris, and her arm hung uselessly at her side, blood seeping through the thin suit fabric. The atmosphere outside was wrong for her kind, thin and dry, lacking the gases the Aleri needed to breathe. She could already feel the air inside her helmet thinning. Her visor flickered, cracked at the edge. The display showed oxygen dropping and comms offline. The beacon, her only chance of rescue, was dead. For a moment, her warrior discipline held firm. She began assessing options, calculating, but soon her chest started to tighten. She reached for the emergency supply unit, only to find it shattered. Panic, foreign and sharp, began to rise. Her people were not trained to accept death easily. Thalexa gritted her teeth, trying to stay conscious, but her vision blurred and her thoughts grew slower with each breath. She thought she was alone until she heard something. A loud crash echoed nearby, followed by the sound of metal scraping rock. She turned her head with effort. A second escape pod had landed not far from hers. It looked smaller, scorched badly. The hatch opened with a hiss, and out stumbled a human. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his suit blackened but still functional. His helmet's visor was cracked, yet he moved with urgency, scanning the area. Then his gaze locked on her. He ran. Thalexa's mind struggled to focus. She knew humans from brief meetings, curious beings, unpredictable, tough in ways her people didn't fully understand. He slid to his knees beside her and tapped the side of her helmet, trying to get a reading. Her translator implant clicked on, translating his garbled words, but the connection was weak. "Are you injured? Can you breathe?" he asked. She tried to speak, but only coughed in reply. The human, seeing the problem, checked her air supply and cursed under his breath. Without another word, he unclipped his own oxygen line, pressed it against the seal of her helmet, and manually transferred air from his suit to hers. She wanted to pull away. It was the wrong mix for her biology, xenon and nitrogen instead of ammonia and methane. It would do nothing. Or worse. But something strange happened. Her lungs, instead of rejecting the air, accepted it. Painfully at first, then gradually with less resistance. Her vision steadied. Her thoughts sharpened. Aleri adaptability was a point of pride, but even she hadn't known it could go this far. The human looked relieved as she steadied. "That's better," he muttered. He tried to smile, though his eyes looked exhausted. She stared at him in disbelief. He was losing oxygen now, giving up part of his limited supply, and he had no idea it might not have helped her at all. "Why?" she asked, her voice raspy and strained. He looked at her like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because you're not dead yet." The words stuck with her. Not dead yet. Not a calculation, not a strategy, just a belief that life, any life, was worth trying for. The human, whose suit tag read L. Reed, began clearing the debris from her leg, wincing as he moved his injured arm. "We need to get higher," he said. "Boost the signal. If anyone's listening, they'll be searching for survivors on high ground." Thalexa knew he was right. But even standing would be nearly impossible. Still, her instincts whispered a truth she hadn't expected to feel. This human was more than just a soldier. He was a lifeline. And somehow, in the cold wasteland of this silent moon, the only thing more shocking than surviving was knowing she didn't want to do it alone. As the wind picked up and night began to fall across the cratered landscape, they both turned their eyes toward the distant ridge, unaware of what was already watching from the sky. The cold wind bit into Mason Reed's suit as he tightened the straps around Thalexa's broken leg with torn fabric from his emergency pack. The ridge above them seemed farther than before, even though they hadn't moved yet. Thalexa watched him quietly, her breathing steady now, but her face pale with exhaustion. Her body still struggled to adjust to the human oxygen mix, though she showed no weakness. Her people didn't believe in showing pain. Mason, on the other hand, was clearly injured. The left side of his helmet was scorched, and his steps had a limp. But he didn't stop moving, didn't slow down. He kept checking her oxygen levels, his own running dangerously low. "We've got maybe 2 hours, tops," he muttered, looking at the jagged terrain ahead. His voice was calm, but the worry in his eyes was easy to read. Thalexa sat up slowly, biting back a sharp hiss as pain shot through her side. "You gave me your oxygen," she said quietly. That was not logical. Mason glanced at her and gave a weak grin. "Yeah, well, logic's not really my thing." He looked away before she could answer, tightening the last strap around her knee. "You were dying. I wasn't about to watch that happen." His words were simple, but they shook her more than she wanted to admit. Back on Ellery Prime, they taught that humans were primitive, too emotional, too chaotic. But there was something about this man, alone and bleeding on a dead moon, who had given her his last breath without knowing if it would help. It made her question things she'd believed for years. "We need to move," he said, pulling out a damaged but still functioning signal booster. "If we reach the ridge, I can reroute this thing to piggyback off the satellite trails. Might get a message out." Thalexa tried to stand but nearly collapsed. Her injured leg couldn't hold her weight. Mason caught her before she hit the ground. "No way you're walking," he said. Then, without asking, he turned around and crouched. "Climb on." Thalexa blinked in surprise. "You can't carry me. You're injured." "I'm stubborn," he replied, glancing over his shoulder. "Come on. This place isn't going to get any warmer." For a long moment, she hesitated. Allery pride was not easily put aside. Being carried was unacceptable. But dying here was more unacceptable. So she swallowed her pride, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and climbed on. The climb was brutal. The rocks were sharp, the slope uneven, and the cold grew worse with every step. Mason's breath came heavier with each meter, and twice he nearly slipped. But he never stopped. Thalexa, riding on his back, could feel his body weakening, his suit alarms quietly flashing warnings. She wanted to say something, warn him, order him to rest, but the words didn't come. Instead, she watched the horizon, keeping an eye out for danger. Somewhere above them, the sky flickered with strange blue lights. "The ion trail's still active," Mason said between breaths. "Means interference. Might scramble the signal even if we reach the top." Thalexa knew he was right. And worse, she felt a strange buzzing in her head, her translator chip glitching again. She reached for her helmet controls and tapped a reset, but the system didn't respond. "Stop," she said suddenly. Mason froze, half sliding against a loose patch of gravel. "What is it?" She turned her head, scanning the sky. For a moment, it had seemed like something moved, something mechanical. But nothing was there now. "I thought I saw something," she said quietly. "A drone, maybe." Mason squinted. "Scavengers?" he asked. She nodded once. "Could be." Scavenger drones were common in outer sectors, machines that harvested wreckage and anything left in crash zones. Some were smart enough to avoid living beings. Others weren't. Mason didn't argue. He picked up the pace, pushing forward even faster. By the time they reached the top of the ridge, he was barely standing. He lowered Thalexa gently against a rock and dropped to one knee, pulling out the booster and connecting it to a patch cord from his suit. "Signal's weak," he muttered, tapping furiously. "But it's pinging." Thalexa leaned back, her head spinning. The oxygen levels in her suit were better now, stable, but Mason's weren't. His face was pale, lips dry, and his hands shook as he worked. She glanced at his tank meter. It was nearly empty. "You need to switch lines," she said. "Use the tank." Mason shook his head without looking at her. "No time. If I stop now, we lose the chance. Satellites rotate out of range in 6 minutes. Thalexa stared at him. "You'll pass out before then." "Then you finish the signal," he replied. "You're stronger than me, remember?" She didn't know what to say to that. She didn't understand this kind of thinking. He was willing to die just to try to get a signal out. Not for glory. Not even for duty. Just because someone else needed it. "You humans," she said quietly, "are reckless." He gave a weak chuckle. "We get that a lot." The booster beeped sharply. A green light flashed. "Got it," he breathed. "Signal sent. Just hope someone's listening." He looked up at her, and for a second, Thalexa saw something in his eyes that wasn't just exhaustion, it was relief. Then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed against the rocks. Thalexa dragged herself forward, pain flaring in her limbs, and rolled him onto his side. His oxygen line was completely dry now. No pressure. His vitals were dropping fast. She stared at her own suit, now adapted to human air, and made a decision. With shaking fingers, she unclipped her helmet, then reached over and sealed it over his. The oxygen rushed into his lungs, and after a long moment, he coughed, gasped, and breathed again. They lay there in silence, the cold night wind howling above them, and the stars turning slowly in the sky. Somewhere in the distance, something mechanical moved through the rocks, and Thalexa knew that survival had only just begun. The signal had been sent, but there was no reply, and the cold wasn't going away. Thalexa sat in the shadows of the ridge, watching Mason's chest rise and fall inside her helmet, slow but steady. He had passed out from oxygen loss, barely alive, and the transfer had saved him just as he had saved her earlier. It made her chest ache in a strange way, not from injury, but something unfamiliar. She didn't understand him, not fully. Her people didn't sacrifice without reason, didn't give without gain. Yet this human had given her air, strength, and carried her up a mountain while bleeding and choking. She had read about human courage in military reports, but now she had seen it with her own eyes, and it didn't feel like bravery, it felt like madness mixed with heart. As the sky darkened into the deep purple of Virex-9's long night, she spotted movement far below flickers of metal, shapes slinking across the rocks. At first, she thought it might be the rescue team, but then she noticed the glint of clawed arms and scanning beams. Scavenger drones. 2 of them, maybe 3. They had picked up the crash site, and they were coming fast. She grabbed Mason's arm and shook him gently. He groaned, then blinked, dazed, the helmet still pressed around his face. "We have to go," she said firmly, her voice louder now. "Now, Mason." He opened his eyes, slowly understanding. "What? Rescue?" She shook her head, already pulling away. "No. Drones." His face hardened, and he forced himself up, wobbling as he stood. "Great. Just great." He yanked a small device from his belt, a flare charge. "This won't kill them, but it might slow them down." Thalexa shook her head. "They'll track heat, energy, movement. They'll chase us. We need to climb higher, get out of scanning range." Mason grimaced, but nodded. "Then, let's move. You lead. I'll cover." She hesitated. "You're weaker than I am now." "Yeah," he said, smiling faintly. "But I've got adrenaline and a bad attitude." They moved fast, climbing a narrow path that twisted along the edge of the cliff. Mason limped heavily, but never once asked to stop. Behind them, the buzzing sound of the drones grew louder, closer. Occasionally, a beam of light swept the rocks behind them. Once, one of the lights touched Mason's leg, and the drone let out a shrill whine, its sensors locking onto their trail. Thalexa spotted a small cave entrance halfway up the slope. "There," she said, pointing. "We take cover and wait them out." Mason didn't argue. They scrambled inside just as a drone flew overhead, its search beam slicing through the air like a knife. The cave was cold and narrow, but dry. Mason collapsed against the wall, gasping. His breathing was shallow, and she saw blood leaking through his suit again. His shoulder wound had reopened. She tore off a strip from her outer sleeve and began to bind it. He didn't complain, just stared at the cave ceiling. "This is not how I imagined diplomacy going," he muttered. Thalexa gave him a glance. "You imagined diplomacy?" He chuckled. "Figured I'd be shaking hands, drinking strange alien wine, not bleeding in a rock hole." She finished tying the bandage. "You're strange. Takes one to know one," he replied. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the sound of the drones faded slightly, but didn't disappear. They were still close, still searching. Thalexa turned to him, her voice quieter. "When you saw me in that wreck, you didn't know if your air would work for me. You had no reason to help. Why did you do it?" Mason looked at her, serious now. "You were dying. I couldn't just walk away. Doesn't matter what species someone is. If they need help, you help." She stared at him, unsure how to respond. That thinking was alien to her. No calculation, no strategy, just choice. After a long pause, she said softly, "That is not weakness." Mason smiled, glad to hear it. Then his eyes flicked toward the cave entrance. They're back. One of the drones had landed on the ridge above, its sharp legs clicking across the rocks. It lowered a scanning arm into the cave mouth. Thalexa froze. Mason reached slowly for a rock, ready to throw it to create a distraction. But before he could, a sharp hiss filled the cave. The drone had detected them. Its eye lit up red, and it lunged forward. Mason threw the rock hard, hitting the drone's sensor. It recoiled for a moment, then advanced. Thalexa grabbed the flare from Mason's belt, ignited it, and hurled it into the drone's face. A burst of light exploded, disorienting it. "Run!" she yelled. They sprinted up the cave tunnel, Mason stumbling but moving fast. Behind them, the drone fired a hook that struck the wall beside Thalexa, pulling a chunk of rock loose. They burst out of the other side of the cave, tumbling down a short drop and landing hard. Mason rolled, coughing but didn't stop. "Keep moving," he shouted. They ran across the high ridge, wind tearing at them. Ahead, Thalexa saw a cluster of metallic towers, wreckage from the upper ship deck. "We can hide there," she said. "Or make a stand." Mason checked the charge pack on his side. "One shot left," he said. "So let's make it count." They reached the towers just as the drone came over the cliff, screeching and static. Thalexa climbed a narrow support beam and kicked loose a hanging wire. "Wrap that charge around it," she said. "When it hits the wire, we trigger the shock." Mason didn't hesitate. He strapped the charge, then took cover. The drone dove. Thalexa waited calm, focused. Then she touched the wire to the charge. A blinding arc of energy surged up the metal. The drone screamed, spun, and crashed into the rocks, smoking and sparking. Silence returned. Mason lay back, panting. "Nice move." Thalexa slid down beside him. "I learned from a reckless human." He laughed, tired but alive. And for the first time, she smiled, not a forced gesture, but something real. The smoke from the destroyed drone still curled into the sky, faint and gray against the darkening stars, as Thalexa and Mason sat in the shadow of the broken tower remains, breathing heavily. The silence between them no longer tense but filled with something like quiet trust. But that silence didn't last long. A sharp buzzing returned from beyond the ridge, louder this time, deeper. More drones. Thalexa rose to her feet first, her body still aching, but her focus sharp. "That wasn't the only one," she said flatly, already scanning the rocky terrain for movement. Mason struggled to his feet, groaning, his hand pressed tight to the wound in his shoulder. "They called for reinforcements," he guessed, eyes narrowing. "They must have picked up our heat signatures again." Thalexa nodded grimly. "And this time, they'll be smarter. The scavengers learn." Mason checked the power level on his sidearm. 1 bar. He tossed it to the ground with a sigh. Empty. She looked at him, then at the distant slope where glowing red sensors were starting to appear. 3. maybe 4 drones moving together in formation. Too many to outrun, too fast to hide from. She turned back toward the crumpled tower remains, and her gaze settled on a half-buried power core, still glowing with faint blue light beneath a collapsed support beam. "We can't fight them head-on," she said, "but maybe we don't have to." Mason followed her line of sight. A power core? That could work if it's stable. Thalexa was already climbing over the debris. "It's not," she said. "It's fractured. But if I reroute the flow manually, I can make it overload. A heat spike like that could fry their circuits, take out all of them if they come close enough." Mason looked concerned. "You'll be right next to it." "I know. It could explode." "I know," she repeated, then turned to look at him. "But it's the only way. You need to climb higher, find open range, and boost the signal again. Call for pickup. If I can buy you 5 minutes, maybe someone will hear us this time." Mason stepped forward. "I'm not leaving you down here to die." She met his eyes without flinching. "You didn't leave me when I was dying. Now it's my turn." Mason shook his head. "That's not how this works." But she placed a hand on his chest, not as a soldier, but as someone who understood what he had already given. "You're the better chance now. The drones won't follow you if I draw them here." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right. But if I see things go wrong, I'm coming back for you." "Then make sure it works before that happens," she said with the ghost of a smile. Mason turned and began the climb, slow but determined, slipping over cracked rocks and broken metal while Thalexa dug her fingers into the shattered panel of the power core, rerouting circuits with bare hands. Sparks bit at her fingertips, and the hum of the machine grew louder, hotter, unstable. She didn't look up when the first drone crested the ridge and locked onto her position. It screamed, scanning, calculating. Then it charged. Thalexa didn't flinch. She adjusted the final capacitor, triggering a short-range surge, and the core spat a burst of white-hot light that hit the drone head-on. The machine spasmed, tumbled, and crashed into the dirt, smoke rising from its crushed frame. But the others were still coming, 3 more, flying fast and angry. Thalexa stood tall beside the humming core, a silhouette in the glow, her injured arm held close to her side, but her eyes sharp and fearless. She was buying time. That was her mission now. And for the first time in her life, it wasn't for duty or command, it was for one human who had refused to let her die alone. Meanwhile, Mason reached the edge of the upper ridge. From here, he had a clear view of the sky and the wreckage around him. He dropped to one knee, pulled out the signal booster, and reconnected the cords, hands trembling but focused. Static filled the channel. Then, a faint ping. Another. He adjusted the frequency, boosted the gain, and prayed. "This is Corporal Mason Reed of Earth Diplomatic Vessel Delta 9, he shouted into the mic. "We have survivors on Virex 9, requesting immediate extraction. Hostile drones active. Coordinates locked." The reply was not instant, but after a moment of static, a voice broke through. "Copy, Delta 9. Signal received. Gunship inbound. ET a 6 minutes." Mason almost collapsed with relief. He looked down the ridge and saw a flash Thalexa dodging another drone, luring it closer to the overloading power core. "Hang on," he muttered. "Come on below." Thalexa triggered another surge, and the second drone collapsed in midair, its systems overloaded. But the last one was smarter. It didn't fly straight into the trap. It hovered, scanning from afar, calculating. She had one shot left, overload the core completely, full detonation. But it would take her with it. She hesitated. Then, just as her fingers reached for the final switch, a sudden blast of gunfire echoed across the rocks. The drone exploded mid-hover, shot through by a rail blast from above. Thalexa looked up and saw a faint shape coming down from the clouds, a gunship, streaking fire behind it. Mason had done it. The ship landed hard, side doors opening, human soldiers flooding out. Mason slid down the ridge, rushing to her side. "You're all right?" he asked, breathless. She nodded slowly, watching the core fade to dim blue. You made the call? Yeah. You held them off long enough. He smiled, and this time, she smiled back without hesitation. Together, they turned to the ship, its ramp lowered, its warm interior glowing like a promise.as. They climbed aboard, wounded, exhausted, and side by side, neither of them looked back at the broken ridge. The fight had been brutal, but something had changed between them. Trust, not just between two soldiers, but between two species. And for the first time, Thalexa believed not just in survival, but in the strange, stubborn heart of humanity. The gunship lifted off slowly, leaving the broken rocks and scorched battlefield behind, its engines humming with steady rhythm as it carried Mason and Thalexa away from the nightmare of Virex 9. Inside the warm, pressurized cabin, medical bots swarmed around them, patching wounds and checking vitals, but the two survivors barely noticed. Mason sat slumped in the corner, the oxygen mask snug over his mouth, eyes half closed from exhaustion, while Thalexa lay across from him, her arm bandaged, armor scorched, but her eyes wide open, staring not at the walls, but at him. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment the drones came, about the way he climbed despite his pain, about the choice he made to call for help instead of hiding or running. Her world had taught her that loyalty had limits, that strategy came before heart, but now after all this, she wasn't so sure. Mason met her gaze after a while, and though no words were spoken, the look said everything. They had survived not just because of luck, not just because of technology, but because they had trusted each other when it mattered most. As the ship pierced the upper atmosphere, blue skies turned into the endless black of space, and the stars returned to view. In front of them, the lights of the orbiting fleet flickered in the distance, human and alien vessels hovering like quiet watchers in the void. A voice crackled over the intercom. Approaching diplomatic cruiser. Preparing to dock. Ambassador teams ready for debriefing. Thalexa sat up straighter at that. Debriefing, she said, almost like it was a bitter taste in her mouth. Mason pulled off his mask and gave her a crooked smile. That's military for. Let's talk about what went wrong. She let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, but not just silence either. They won't believe this, she said quietly. They'll think we're exaggerating. Mason shrugged. Then we'll show them the wreckage. And the drone pieces. And your half-fried armor. She glanced down at the scorched marks across her chest plate. Proof of survival, she said. Or proof of chaos. Same thing really, he replied. The gunship landed smoothly inside the hangar bay, where waiting officers, some human, some of Thalexa's kind, stood ready. They stepped down the ramp together, side by side, every eye watching them as they walked. Mason's limp was heavier now, but he didn't show pain. Thalexa walked with a soldier's posture, proud but quiet. Her people stared at her in confusion, some in concern, others with suspicion. One of them stepped forward, a high-ranking commander in dark armor. Thalexa, he said sharply. Report. Are you injured? Were you compromised? She stared at him for a long second, then said, I was saved. By a human. The commander blinked, clearly not expecting that. Mason looked over but didn't speak. Thalexa continued. He gave me oxygen. Carried me through hostile terrain. We were attacked by scavenger drones. We destroyed them. We worked together. The commander's expression was hard to read. Unusual tactics, he said. Unusual loyalty. She met his gaze directly. No. Just survival. And trust. There was a pause. Then the commander turned and walked away without a word. That was how her people showed respect, no argument, no praise, just silence. Mason's own superior, an older officer with silver hair, clapped him on the back. Reed. You're lucky. Most wouldn't have made it through that crash. Mason gave a tired nod. I wasn't alone. The officer looked at Thalexa, then at Mason. Apparently not. You've made quite an impression. Mason didn't reply. He didn't need to. The rest of the day was a blur, medical checks, interviews, long reports. Mason and Thalexa were separated, questioned, examined, treated. And yet, through it all, Their thoughts kept drifting back to the mountain, to the silence between them as the cold wind blew, to the shared breath in a broken helmet. There was no official record of that moment. No camera, no audio, no sensor logs. But it was the moment everything had changed, not just for them, but perhaps for what their species would believe about each other. 2 days later, a ceremony was held. Not a grand one, not public, but attended by diplomats and commanders from both sides. Mason and Thalexa stood on the small stage, their uniforms cleaned, their injuries mostly healed. A medal was placed in Mason's hand for bravery and unity beyond protocol. Thalexa received a similar honor, though her people called it something different: recognition of unusual valor. The room clapped politely, but the true weight of what they'd done was still sinking in. Afterward, they stood outside on the observation deck, watching stars drift across the black sky. Mason leaned on the railing, quiet. "You going back home?" he asked after a moment. Thalexa shook her head. "Not yet. I've requested to stay in Joint Command. We'll be working together more now." He looked at her, surprised. "Didn't think your people liked humans that much." She smiled faintly. "Some still don't. But I've seen enough to know better." A long silence passed between them. Then Mason said, "Next time, remind me to stay away from unexplored planets." She raised an eyebrow. "You'd still follow a distress signal, even now?" "Yeah," he admitted. "Guess I would." As they stood under the stars, no longer strangers, no longer just soldier and alien, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that no report could fully explain, no medal could reward.